The frigid air burned Lynette's lungs as she paced her way down the icy glass streets of the city. No mages and witches and wizards alike made their way around the streets briskly, all trying to get to places of work and warmth. She pulled her wool scarf tighter around her neck as the wind whipped past. She was late and exhausted. Her grandmother had been gone for over a month now, just up and left in quite the hurry, with only a single hour of correspondence to tell them she'd made it all the way to London. While it wasn't odd of Lady Decker to recruit people from outside the country, the nature of which she'd had went about it was strange. Even more so that she refused to divulge the details to even her best jeweller and kin, Lynette herself. She picked up her pace, counting down the seconds until she could change out of the over-frilled garment, weighted down by the wool shall she adorned. Either way, Lady Decker had appointed her as stand-in head of the organisation, Wayward Wands in her absence, something she took great pride and care in. Lost in thought, she almost missed the entrance to Killian Road, the heavily guarded and magical entrance to one of New York's most prominent wizarding shopping districts. She could already smell the roasting toffee cashews and drying rosemary from the first and her favourite shop on the corner, Concession Cauldron. 2 lefts and a right later, she skittered down the damp and dreary alleyway, now having mastered keeping no mages none the wiser. As she came to the alley's end, the ever-familiar white brick wall stood tall and proud. Atop it sat a long-haired cat, black as coal, and staring at her with sharp, watchful eyes. "Good morning, France," she greeted the cat, who swished his tail in response, jumping down from his perch with effortless grace. With his blessing, as always, she took her wand out from her holster inside her brightly coloured shawl, flicking it once and muttering, "Bells, whistles, songs and thistles, let me pass." There was a soft rumble as the brick, like a massive moving puzzle, shifted and rearranged, opening up to a bustling magical shopping centre. The old buildings were lined with green and red tents with store samples. They stood out among the white powdered cobblestone, as did the brightly robed folks who walked among them. There were wreaths and floating lanterns everywhere, as everyone was preparing for Christmas festivities. And like she had predicted, Concession Cauldron had the nut car out with roasted honey pecans, toffee cashews, and salted walnuts. She pushed into the crowded street. There were more shoppers than usual, and she felt it would delay her further. The last thing she needed was Rebecca chastising her for tardiness. Little did she know that would be the least of her problems that day. Suddenly, there was a sharp yank on her skirt as she was pulled into a nearby alcove. Before she could even yelp, she spun to see. "Speak of the devil," she muttered, Rebecca glaring at her and holding up the daily paper in front of her. "Please tell me you've already seen this, and I'm not going to be the bearer of bad news this morning. Mind explaining why your family is on the front page of the New York Ghost?" she said, trying to keep the panic from raising her voice. Lynette snatched the paper from Rebecca's grip, eyes wide. There, splashed across the Sunrise edition, was the unmistakable image of her Uncle Dremon, with the header, "Choate speak out, more riddles and ridicule." Her eyes skimmed the text below the outrageous headline. "Dreamin' Choate speaks on his brother's behalf on the rumour circulating of a possible partnership with none other than New York's infamous Burnwells and North American top wands makers, the Choates. The Burnwells, whose dark history and entanglement with MACUSA has raised eyebrows across the board, some speculating on why such a union would be made." The paper suddenly went up in smoke. Lynette was fuming. "News? This is just a glorified gossip column at this point." Lynette wrung her hands in frustration, while Rebecca looked worried, chewing on her full lower lip harshly. The problem was not just the article, but the fact that there was some possible truth behind it. Possible. Right before Lady Decker had taken off, the Burnwells had visited her old family's estate. She recognised that famous seraphime pony-drawn carriage anywhere. The beast, with its 4 red eyes and massive black wings, snorted at her as it took off past her carriage coming in that day. However, neither of her parents would budge an inch on what had transpired behind the walls of their home. She gripped the infuriating choker at her throat, wishing she could rip it off and learn the truth behind all of this. There were too many secrets floating around for her liking. "Let me guess. The papers this morning are selling like caramelized funnel cakes at a fair," Lynette scoffed. Rebecca sighed through her nose, arms folding across her bright yellow wool jacket. She fidgeted with the whimsical brass buttons nervously. "They are selling the paper for a dragot less today," she mumbled. Lynette tapped her foot, now more nervous and vexed than ever. Someone wanted this news to spread and fast. "Come on, we should get to the dueling hall before we attract any attention," Lynette whispered. The witches linked arms and apparated together to the bright red door of the WW. The building was one of the oldest in the city, and it had been kept in fine order since then. Lynette dug in her pockets and pulled out a small winged key. It flitted to the lock, and with a click the door swung open. They sighed in relief as they stepped into the warm building. Then she paused. "What's wrong, Lynn?" Rebecca asked. "It's warm. Someone already stoked the main fireplace," Lynette said, brows furrowing. The women looked at each other and then hurried to the parlour. She knew who it was before she even set foot into the ornate room. She knew that smell of citrus-laced tobacco anywhere. "Grandmother, your Lynette was stopped short, for indeed, her grandmother was back. She sat next to the roaring fireplace, dressed in her signature silk dress, a new pipe in hand, reclined in her favourite plush chair. The old witch breathed out a puff of smoke. It curled in the air, morphing into the shape of a butterfly, and it fluttered towards the ceiling. It was not the pipe that caught her attention, though. It was the tall, broad and young wizard next to her, a wizard that she did not recognise in the slightest. She would have remembered a face like that. He had dark brown eyes that were watchful and a sharp jawline, all roughishness paradoxed by a sea of boyish freckles and a dimple on his right cheek as he smiled politely at her. "I see you've brought company," Lynette commented, voice laced with suspicion. "And I see you're late, taking a stroll through town again? Do you forget you can apparate, dear?" her grandmother retorted. Lynette swallowed. That was her grandmother's way of saying to shut it and listen, for the older woman knew very well why Lynette couldn't apparate too often. Lady Decker blew another smoke butterfly before setting her pipe on the glass end table beside her. "Allow me to introduce Mr. Sallow, my newest jeweller, and Sallow, my granddaughter and protégée Lynette Rose Choate, as well as her associate Rebecca Thitrin," she said, and her granddaughter raised an eyebrow before schooling her expression and giving the new member a tight smile. "Welcome to Wayward Wands. A pleasure to meet you, Mr. Sallow." The words came out just a tad curt. His smile broadened as his eyes quickly flicked over her form. "Pleasure is all mine," he said, giving a slight nod of his head. "Lady Decker has spoken much of you. Don't worry, all good things, of course." There was something she couldn't place in his tone. Maybe it was the accent. "Your accent, English? Hint of Scottish, perhaps?" Lynette commented. "Astute observation, albeit an obvious one. I hail from Felcroft, a small town outside of Hogwarts in the Highlands," he explained. Something about the way he spoke to her made her chew the inside of her cheek. It was both charming and a little infuriating, though she couldn't place why. "And where exactly did you catch the eye of our scouts?" Lynette asked. Sebastian smiled, turned to a smirk. Why Lady Decker did herself, of course, knows talent when she sees it, even in the most obscure places. She couldn't stop the gape in her mouth at his words. She could practically feel Rebecca's shock behind her as well. Lady Decker, though, did recruit scouts and travel at once. The scouts had picked up illegible witches and wizards. It was another thing entirely for her to go off her own volition, with no middleman involved. Unless they were well known on the duelling stage, and Lynette had never once heard of the name Sallow, even in foreign gossip circles. Must have quite the presence on stage to catch grandmother's attention, she said, clearing her throat. Though I don't believe I've heard the name Sallow in the ring, she commented. Rebecca, I haven't given our newest member a tour of our building yet. Why don't you start with housing rooms and then move on to Marksman Hall? The old witch said. Lynette stiffened as Rebecca gestured for Mr. Sallow to follow. As he passed, he gave her a wink, and her mouth twitched downward for a split second in response. Once alone, it took everything in Lynette not to start spinning in circles. I know you're full of questions, Lady Decker started. Understatement, Lynette interjected. But I already saw the papers this morning, as I'm sure you did. All you need to know for now is that there are things at stake here, Lynette. Things I'm trying to remedy before it gets worse. Worse, good lords! What is going on? The Burnwells and now this! What more are you not telling me? Who really is this guy? Lynette groaned. Lady Decker sighed, grabbing back up her pipe and blowing out another smoky creature. That gentleman is not just another duelist, my dear. He is our way of fixing this mess, she said. The young witch's eyes grew wide. And how on earth is that? Why, dear, he is your new betrothed. Just down the hall, just as Rebecca had been explaining a little bit of the history of the building, a loud thumb vibrated the walls, the crystal chandeliers tinkling as it happened. What in the name? Rebecca said in shock. Ah, the poor thing must have just gotten the news. Sebastian said more to himself and gave a small, soft chuckle. Beg your pardon? Who found out what? Rebecca said. Oh, nothing. I'm sure Lady Decker will elaborate shortly. Now, let's see this famed Marksman Hall.